The easiest people to underestimate are the ones who have already spent a lifetime carrying burdens nobody else could survive. Nobody inside Blackstone State Prison knew those words, but if they had, they would have understood exactly what was about to happen. The cafeteria was louder than usual that morning. Plastic trays slid across metal counters. Coffee steamed from old paper cups. Conversations bounced off the concrete walls while correctional officers watched from the security platform above. For most inmates, breakfast was just another routine that helped break up an endless string of identical days. But routines had a strange way of ending the moment somebody unexpected walked through the door. Samuel Brooks entered the cafeteria carrying a plain gray tray with eggs, toast, and a small carton of milk. He was older than almost everyone around him. His hair had turned silver around the edges, and deep lines marked the corners of his face. He moved slowly, but not because he was weak. He moved with the careful rhythm of someone who had learned that rushing rarely solved anything. Most of the younger inmates barely looked at him. A few older prisoners did. They watched the way he carried himself. The straight back, the steady breathing, the quiet eyes that never wandered without purpose. One old inmate sitting near the window lowered his newspaper and frowned. Something about the new arrival felt familiar, though he could not explain why. At the center of the cafeteria sat Jason Walker. Every prison had someone like him, a man who believed respect came from making other people uncomfortable. He laughed louder than everyone else. He took the best table. The younger inmates copied him because they thought confidence and wisdom were the same thing. Jason noticed Samuel the moment he entered the room. He looked at the older black inmate, then at the men sitting beside him, and a grin slowly spread across his face. "Look at that," he said. "Somebody's grandpa took the wrong bus." The table erupted with laughter. Samuel did not react. He simply continued walking toward an empty seat near the back wall. Jason watched him pass. The silence from the older man bothered him more than he expected. Most new inmates looked nervous. Some tried to act tough. Others stared at the floor. This one did none of those things. He walked like he had already accepted wherever life decided to put him. Jason stood up. The laughter around the table faded as everyone watched him cross the cafeteria. Even the correctional officers noticed the movement. Officer Michael Hayes looked up from his clipboard and quietly followed the scene with his eyes. Samuel reached the empty table and carefully set down his tray. Before he could sit, Jason stepped beside him. "You hear me talking to you, old man?" Samuel looked up calmly. "I heard someone talking." A few inmates nearby covered small smiles. Jason folded his arms. "You think you are funny?" Samuel looked at the chair beside the table. "No, I was hoping to eat breakfast." The answer was so simple that the entire room seemed to hesitate for a second. Jason looked around at the faces watching him. Then, with a careless motion, he bumped the edge of the tray with his foot. The carton of milk rolled across the floor. The toast slipped onto the concrete. The plastic tray spun once before coming to a stop. Nobody spoke. The entire cafeteria went silent except for the distant buzz of the air vents overhead. Officer Hayes took one step forward, but stopped. He expected anger. He expected shouting. Instead, Samuel simply looked down at the scattered breakfast. Then he slowly bent over and picked up the tray. He brushed a little dust from the edge with the sleeve of his uniform. His movements were calm, careful, unhurried. Jason stared at him. "That is it," he asked. "You are not even mad." Samuel looked at the younger man for a long moment. There was no fear in his face, no bitterness, only a quiet expression that somehow made the entire room feel smaller. Finally he spoke. "Son, I learned a long time ago that losing a meal is not the worst thing that can happen to a person." The old inmate by the window slowly lowered his newspaper completely. Officer Hayes felt something strange tighten in his chest. Even Jason's smile faded for just a second. Nobody inside Blackstone understood why those words carried so much weight. Nobody knew where the old man had been before he walked through those prison gates. But before the week was over, every person in that cafeteria would discover that the quiet inmate picking up his own tray had spent 30 years teaching America's toughest soldiers how to stay calm when the whole world around them was falling apart. The cafeteria stayed silent for several long seconds after Samuel Brooks picked up his tray. The younger inmates looked from the older man to Jason Walker and back again, waiting for something else to happen. In places like Blackstone State Prison, moments like that usually ended with shouting, threats, or somebody trying to prove a point. But none of those things came. Samuel simply gathered the carton of milk, placed it back on the tray, and quietly walked toward another table near the window. He sat down, bowed his head for a moment, and began eating what little remained of his breakfast as though the interruption had never happened. Jason stood where he was, the small grin still on his face, but something about the old man's reaction felt wrong. One of the younger inmates beside him laughed loudly. "I told you he was harmless." The others joined in, but Jason did not. He kept watching Samuel. Most people showed something when they were embarrassed. Anger, fear, pride. The older black inmate had shown none of those things. It was almost as if losing his breakfast meant nothing at all. Officer Michael Hayes remained near the cafeteria entrance pretending to check paperwork. He had worked corrections for nearly 20 years, and he had learned to pay attention to details other people missed. The old inmate had never looked at the spilled food. He had looked at Jason, calmly, carefully, not with hatred, not with fear, almost like a teacher looking at a student who had made a poor decision. Hayes could not explain why that bothered him. Across the room, one of the oldest prisoners in the block slowly folded his newspaper and carried his coffee towards Samuel's table. The old inmate sat down without asking permission. Samuel looked up and nodded politely. "Morning." The older prisoner smiled. "Most people around here call me Frank Miller." Samuel returned the small smile. "Samuel Brooks." Frank glanced toward Jason's table. "You handled that better than most men would." Samuel looked down at his tray. "A meal can be replaced." Frank leaned back in his chair. "You talk like somebody who has seen worse things." Samuel took a sip of coffee before answering. "Everybody has their own hard road." Frank noticed the answer did not really answer the question. He had spent 30 years moving through prisons across 3 different states. He knew when a man was hiding a story. What surprised him was that Samuel did not seem interested in hiding because of shame. He looked like a man protecting old memories that no longer belonged to anyone else. A young inmate carrying his own breakfast stopped beside the table. He looked nervous. "Mind if I sit here?" Samuel moved his tray slightly. "There is plenty of room." The young man introduced himself as Ryan Cole. He could not have been older than 23. His hands shook slightly while he ate. After a few minutes, he quietly asked, "Does that guy always act like that?" Frank laughed under his breath. "Jason thinks the whole prison belongs to him." Ryan looked toward Samuel. "You are not afraid of him?" Samuel looked out the narrow window where the first sunlight touched the outer fence. "Fear is a useful thing." Ryan looked confused. "Then why did you not show any?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. Finally he answered, "Because sometimes the person standing in front of you is fighting a battle you cannot see." Frank slowly turned his head and looked at Samuel again. There was something in the old man's voice that felt heavy, like words repeated many times over many years. Across the cafeteria, Jason had not stopped watching. One of his friends nudged him. "Forget about him." Jason shook his head. "No, why?" Jason leaned forward. "Did you see his hands?" The younger inmate frowned. "What about them?" Not once did they shake. The comment sounded strange, even to Jason himself, but he could not let it go. Officer Hayes heard it too. He looked across the room and noticed something he had missed before. Samuel held his fork with steady precision. His posture never changed. His breathing stayed slow and controlled. Hayes remembered seeing men like that once during a training seminar hosted by former military instructors years ago. They had carried themselves with the same quiet discipline. The officer looked down at the transfer paperwork clipped to his board. The file was surprisingly thin. Name, age, sentence, transfer authorization. Nothing else. Hayes frowned. A man did not reach almost 60 years old with eyes like that and leave behind so little history. Across the room, Samuel finished the last bite of breakfast and carefully folded the paper napkin beside his tray. Ryan watched him. Frank watched him. Even Jason watched him. None of them knew it yet, but the old inmate they had dismissed that morning had spent most of his life teaching young soldiers one simple lesson. Stay calm when everyone else loses control, because that is the moment that reveals who people really are. The morning work assignments were posted an hour after breakfast, and the entire block slowly emptied into long gray hallways that smelled of old paint and floor wax. Blackstone State Prison ran on routine. Men cleaned corridors, repaired furniture, sorted laundry, or worked in the small maintenance building behind the main yard. Officer Michael Hayes stood beside the assignment board checking names while inmates formed a line. When Samuel Brooks stepped forward to receive his card, Hayes noticed something unusual. The older man accepted the paper with a polite nod and immediately moved aside without looking at it twice. Most new transfers always checked their assignments again. Some complained. Others asked questions. Samuel simply folded the card once and slipped it into his pocket. Ryan Cole hurried after him. "You did not even look," the younger inmate said. Samuel smiled faintly. "It tells me where to go." Ryan laughed. "You trust them that much?" Samuel looked down the hallway where the morning sunlight stretched across the concrete floor. A man wastes a lot of time worrying about things he cannot change. Frank Miller, walking a few steps behind them, quietly listened without saying a word. The old prisoner had spent decades studying people because surviving prison often depended on understanding them. Samuel spoke like someone who had learned difficult lessons long before coming to Blackstone. Across the hall, Jason Walker watched the three men disappear toward the maintenance building. One of his friends leaned against the wall beside him. "You are still thinking about the old guy." Jason folded his arms. "Something about him is strange. He is just an old man." Jason shook his head slowly. "Old men do not look at people like that." The younger inmate frowned. "Like what?" Jason looked toward the far end of the corridor. "Like they already know exactly what you are going to do." Inside the maintenance building, rows of shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Boxes of tools, cleaning supplies, and old equipment filled the room. Samuel quietly began organizing one section while Ryan worked nearby, stacking empty containers. Frank was assigned to repair old chairs at the far wall. For nearly 30 minutes, nobody spoke. The only sounds came from boxes sliding across shelves and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Ryan finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel placed another box into line. "You can ask. Were you ever in the military?" Samuel looked at the label in his hand before putting it in place. "Why would you think that?" Ryan pointed toward the shelves. "Everything is lined up perfectly." Frank looked over from his workbench. He had noticed the same thing. Every box faced the same direction. Every label could be read from the aisle. Even the heavier supplies had been arranged where they could be reached easily. Samuel brushed a little dust from his hands. "Order makes life simpler." Ryan smiled. "That is not really an answer." Samuel looked around the room. "Sometimes the best answer is the simple one." Officer Hayes entered the building carrying a clipboard. He stopped walking when he saw the supply shelves. He had inspected that room 2 days earlier, and it had looked nothing like this. Everything now sat in perfect rows. The older officer slowly walked closer. "Who organized all this?" Ryan immediately pointed toward Samuel. Hayes looked at the older inmate. "You did this by yourself?" Samuel nodded once. There was enough time. Hayes stared at the shelves for another moment. A memory suddenly returned to him. 20 years earlier, he had attended a security seminar taught by retired military instructors. One of them had spent an entire afternoon explaining that discipline was simply respect made visible. The training room had looked exactly like this. Nothing out of place. Nothing wasted. Hayes quietly checked the thin transfer file clipped to his board. Name, age, sentence, transfer authorization. Nothing else. The lack of information bothered him more than before. At lunch break, the inmates returned to the cafeteria. Samuel carried his tray to the same table by the window. Ryan and Frank sat with him. Jason watched from across the room. This time he did not laugh. He simply stared at the older black inmate arranging his fork, napkin, and cup with the same careful precision he had shown all morning. Frank leaned toward Samuel and spoke quietly. "You know everybody is trying to figure you out." Samuel looked out the window where a flock of birds crossed above the outer fence. "People usually spend too much time trying to understand others." Ryan smiled. "Then what should they do?" Samuel picked up his cup of coffee. "They should spend more time understanding themselves." Officer Hayes heard the answer while passing the table. Jason heard it too. Neither man realized it yet, but the quiet inmate sitting by the window had built his entire life around teaching that exact lesson to young soldiers before they ever faced their first real test. The afternoon passed slowly, and by the time the final work assignments ended, almost everyone inside Blackstone State Prison had heard some version of the story about the old inmate whose breakfast had been knocked onto the floor. Rumors traveled faster than official announcements behind prison walls. Some men claimed Samuel Brooks had once been a police officer. Others said he had served in the military. A few insisted he had simply grown too old to care about what anybody thought. Samuel himself seemed completely unaware that people were talking about him. He walked back from the maintenance building beside Ryan Cole, carrying a small stack of library books that had been left in storage. Ryan looked at the titles and laughed quietly. History again? Samuel nodded. There's a lot to learn from people who came before us. Ryan balanced another book under his arm. I never liked history in school. Samuel smiled. Most young people do not. Then one day they realize history is really just a collection of mistakes and lessons. Frank Miller was waiting near the library door when they arrived. The older inmate closed his newspaper and stood up. Mind if I join you? Samuel moved one of the books aside. There is room. The three men sat around a small table while the late afternoon sun came through the narrow windows. The library was one of the quietest places in the prison. Even Jason Walker rarely came there. Ryan looked at Samuel for a moment before speaking. Can I ask you something personal? Samuel looked at him calmly. You can ask. Ryan hesitated. Do you have family waiting for you outside? Samuel rested one hand on the cover of the history book. I have people I care about. Ryan nodded slowly. Do they visit? Samuel looked toward the window. Sometimes life sends people down different roads. Frank noticed the answer was careful, almost practiced. The old inmate had learned that men who carried heavy memories often spoke that way. They answered honestly without opening old doors. Across the prison yard, Officer Michael Hayes stood outside the administration office looking through Samuel's transfer paperwork again. The file continued to bother him. There were court records, medical forms, and transport documents, but almost nothing about the man's life before prison. Hayes had seen hundreds of inmate files over the years. They always contained old employment records, military service, or personal history. Samuel's looked almost empty. The officer walked into the records room and handed the folder to the clerk behind the desk. Can you run another background check? The woman adjusted her glasses. Already did. Hayes frowned. Try again. She typed quietly for a few moments. Then she stopped. That is strange. Hayes stepped closer. What is it? The clerk pointed at the screen. It says additional records are unavailable. Hayes looked confused. Unavailable. She nodded. I have never seen that before. Hayes looked back down at the thin folder. Somehow the lack of information created more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Jason Walker sat in the recreation yard with two members of his group. One of them laughed while tossing a baseball into the air. You are still thinking about the old man, are you? Jason looked toward the library building. Yeah. Why? Jason took a slow breath. Because nothing about him makes sense. The younger inmate shrugged. Maybe he is just stubborn. Jason slowly shook his head. No. Stubborn people want you to know they are stubborn. He looked toward the library again. That guy acts like he has already seen everything this place can throw at him. Inside the library, Frank stood up and gathered his newspaper. Before leaving, he looked at Samuel one last time. You know what I think? Samuel closed the history book. What? Frank smiled faintly. I think you spent your whole life teaching people something important. Ryan looked surprised. How could you know that? Frank pointed toward Samuel's table. Because he answers questions the way good teachers do. Ryan turned back toward Samuel. Is he right? Samuel looked at the fading sunlight beyond the window. A small smile crossed his face before disappearing again. A teacher is just someone who hopes another person will not have to learn the hard way. None of them noticed Officer Hayes standing outside the library door. He had heard every word, and for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt certain that the quiet old inmate sitting by the window had once carried responsibilities far greater than anyone inside Blackstone could imagine. The next morning arrived with a cold wind moving across the prison yard, carrying dry leaves against the outer fence while Blackstone slowly came to life. Steel doors opened. Officers changed shifts. Inmates lined up for breakfast. Everything looked ordinary, but Ryan Cole could feel that something had changed since the day Samuel Brooks arrived. Men who normally talked through the entire morning stood a little quieter when the older inmate walked by. They did not seem afraid of him. They simply watched him. Samuel entered the cafeteria carrying his tray exactly as he had the day before. Calm, unhurried. His shoulders stayed straight, and his eyes moved slowly across the room without lingering on anyone. Ryan hurried over with his own breakfast and sat beside him. You know, people keep talking about you, he said. Samuel unfolded his napkin. People need something to talk about. Ryan smiled. Most of them think you were in the army. Samuel looked at the coffee in front of him. Most guesses are usually wrong. Frank Miller joined them a few moments later carrying a newspaper under one arm. He looked around before taking his seat. The funny thing about prisons, Frank said, is that the truth usually sounds less believable than the rumors. Samuel nodded once. That is true almost everywhere. Across the cafeteria, Jason Walker sat with the same group that followed him every day. One of the younger inmates laughed quietly. There is your old man. Jason looked toward the window table. Samuel was helping Ryan open a carton of milk that had folded at the corner. The small gesture made no sense to him. Most older inmates tried to keep to themselves. This one treated people with patience, almost like he had known them for years. I still think he is hiding something, Jason said. One of his friends shrugged. Maybe he is just trying to survive. Jason slowly shook his head. No. Men trying to survive usually want everyone to know they are dangerous. He kept watching Samuel. That guy acts like he has nothing left to prove. Officer Michael Hayes entered the cafeteria carrying the transfer file once again. He told himself he was only checking paperwork, but the truth was harder to ignore. Something about Samuel Brooks reminded him of an instructor he had met almost 20 years earlier during a security training course. The man had been quiet, respectful, never the loudest person in the room. Yet every officer there had listened when he spoke. Hayes remembered asking one of the military organizers who the instructor was. The answer had been simple. One of the best teachers we ever had. The memory returned so clearly that Hayes looked down at Samuel's file again. Name, age, sentence, transfer authorization. Nothing else. It felt incomplete. Breakfast ended, and the inmates moved toward their daily assignments. Samuel, Ryan, and Frank were sent back to the maintenance building. As they walked across the yard, Ryan looked at the older man. Can I ask you another question? Samuel smiled faintly. You usually do. Ryan laughed. Did you ever teach for a living? Frank looked over immediately. He wanted to hear the answer too. Samuel looked toward the guard tower standing above the fence line. A long time ago, he said quietly. I spent many years helping young people prepare for difficult days. Ryan's eyes widened. What kind of days? Samuel was silent for a few steps. Finally, he answered. The kind that change a person forever. Frank felt a chill run through him. The words sounded simple, but they carried a weight he could almost feel. Inside the maintenance building, Samuel quietly returned to organizing supplies. Ryan worked beside him while Frank repaired another old chair. Officer Hayes stepped into the doorway to perform a routine inspection. He stopped walking almost immediately. The storage room looked different again. Every shelf was perfect. Every tool rested exactly where it belonged. Even the old maintenance supervisor had never kept the room this organized. Hayes looked at Samuel. You did all this? Samuel brushed a little dust from his hands. It makes the next man's job easier. Hayes stood there for a moment without speaking. That sentence struck him harder than he expected. He had heard something almost identical once before. During that old training seminar, the military instructor had looked at a room full of young recruits and said, "The mark of a professional is leaving things better for the person who comes after you." Hayes suddenly realized why Samuel Brooks seemed so familiar. It was not his face. It was the way he thought. Across the room, Jason Walker stood outside the open doorway watching without being noticed. He listened to the conversation, looked at the perfectly ordered shelves, and for the first time since the old inmate arrived, he began to wonder if knocking that breakfast tray onto the floor had been a much bigger mistake than he first believed. The afternoon sun hung low over Blackstone State Prison, casting long shadows across the recreation yard while inmates walked slow circles around the cracked pavement. It was one of the few hours of the day when people could think without walls closing in around them. Samuel Brooks walked alone near the outer fence with his hands behind his back, moving at the same calm pace he always did. Ryan Cole hurried to catch up. You know, the younger inmate said, slightly out of breath. I think everybody in this place is trying to figure you out. Samuel looked ahead without changing his pace. People spend too much time solving the wrong puzzles. Ryan laughed. That sounds like something a professor would say. Samuel smiled faintly. I was never a professor. Ryan looked at him. Then what were you? Samuel stayed quiet for several steps. A cool breeze moved across the yard, carrying dry leaves against the chain-link fence. Finally, he answered. A long time ago, I helped young people prepare for difficult jobs. Ryan waited for more, but nothing came. Across the yard, Jason Walker sat at a concrete table with two members of his group. He was pretending to play cards, but his eyes kept drifting towards Samuel. One of the younger inmates noticed. You are watching him again. Jason picked up a card without looking at it. I do not trust people who stay that calm. Maybe he is scared and hiding it. Jason slowly shook his head. No, how can you tell? Jason looked toward the walking track, where Samuel and Ryan continued their quiet conversation. Because scared people look around to see who is watching them. He narrowed his eyes. That old man does not care who is watching. Frank Miller sat alone on a nearby bench with his newspaper folded beside him. He had been listening without making it obvious. After 30 years inside different prisons, he had learned that men often revealed more when they believed nobody was paying attention. He watched Samuel stop near the fence and look up at the evening sky. Ryan stood beside him. Do you ever miss being outside? The young inmate asked. Samuel looked at the clouds moving slowly overhead. You mean being free? Ryan nodded. Samuel thought about the question for a moment. Freedom is a strange thing. Ryan looked confused. How so? Samuel rested one hand on the fence. Some people lose it because of walls. He looked back at the younger man. Others lose it because of memories. Frank lowered his eyes. The answer sounded less like a conversation and more like something a man had learned through experience. Officer Michael Hayes stepped into the yard carrying his clipboard. He walked his normal route, checking corners and counting inmates. But he found himself slowing down as he passed Samuel and Ryan. The older inmate stood perfectly still, watching the sky for a few seconds before quietly continuing his walk. Hayes noticed something else. Samuel always seemed to know where everyone was without obviously looking. Officers, gates, cameras, inmates. Nothing escaped his attention. Hayes had only seen that kind of awareness once before during a joint training exercise many years ago. He remembered one retired military instructor telling a room full of young officers, the first lesson is simple. Learn to observe before you react. The memory stayed with him as he continued his rounds. Later that evening, after the yard closed, the inmates returned to the cafeteria for dinner. Samuel carried his tray to the same table near the window. Ryan and Frank joined him. Jason watched from across the room, but this time he did not laugh or make another joke. He simply studied the older man. Ryan noticed it too. I think he wants to ask you something. Samuel unfolded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. Then he will ask. Frank smiled quietly. And what if you do not want to answer? Samuel looked at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Not every question needs an explanation. Officer Hayes walked past their table with the transfer file tucked beneath his arm. He had requested another records search that afternoon, but the response made even less sense than before. Additional history unavailable. Archived records protected. Authorization required. He stopped for a second and looked at Samuel. The older inmate happened to glance up at the same moment. Their eyes met briefly. Hayes felt the same strange certainty return. This was not simply an old prisoner trying to finish his sentence. There was a lifetime hidden behind those quiet eyes, and somehow that lifetime had been carefully locked away. Across the cafeteria, Jason Walker folded his arms and continued watching. The old man had not argued. He had not complained. He had not tried to impress anyone. Yet somehow, without saying very much at all, he had become the one person inside Blackstone that nobody could stop thinking about. The next few days passed quietly, but the silence inside Blackstone State Prison felt different than before. Samuel Brooks followed the same routine every morning. He made his bed with perfect corners. He folded his blanket the same way every time. He arrived early for breakfast, thanked the kitchen workers, and carried his tray to the table near the window. Ryan Cole had started doing the same things without realizing it. One morning, Frank Miller noticed the younger inmate carefully straightening his blanket before count. The old prisoner smiled to himself. Looks like somebody is becoming a student. Ryan laughed. I guess I picked up a few habits. Frank looked across the block where Samuel was quietly reading a history book. The funny thing is, I do not think he ever tried to teach you. Ryan looked at the older man for a second. Maybe some people teach without talking. Across the common area, Jason Walker noticed it too. The younger inmates who usually followed him now spent time sitting with Samuel during meals. They asked questions about books, about life, about staying patient. The old black inmate never gave long speeches. Most of the time, he simply listened. Somehow that seemed to matter more. Jason leaned against the wall with one of his friends. You see what is happening? The younger inmate nodded. People like him. Jason frowned. Why? The answer came from Frank Miller as he walked past carrying his newspaper. Because respect is easier to give to someone who does not ask for it. Jason looked at the old prisoner. You think you know everything now? Frank smiled. No. I am just old enough to know the difference between fear and respect. Jason watched him walk away, but the words stayed with him. Later that afternoon, work assignments sent Samuel and Ryan back to the maintenance building. Officer Michael Hayes was already there waiting with his clipboard. He had found another small detail in Samuel's records that morning. Under previous occupation, there was only one word. Instructor. Nothing else. No company. No organization. No explanation. Hayes had spent hours trying to access additional information, but every search ended the same way. Restricted. He watched Samuel quietly organize a shelf of supplies. Every movement looked careful and practiced. Ryan carried a box across the room and accidentally placed it on the wrong shelf. Before he could apologize, Samuel simply picked it up and moved it. The heavier items should stay lower, he said calmly. Ryan looked embarrassed. Sorry. Samuel shook his head. Mistakes are how people learn. Hayes stood completely still. He suddenly remembered another sentence from that military seminar years ago. The instructor had looked at a room full of young officers and said, correct the mistake, not the person. Hayes felt a chill move through him. The words were almost identical. After work detail ended, the inmates returned to the recreation yard. The evening sun painted the sky orange while men walked slow circles around the track. Ryan sat beside Samuel on a bench near the fence. Can I ask you something? Samuel nodded. You can ask. Ryan looked toward the guard tower. Have you ever trained people to do dangerous jobs? Samuel looked out across the empty field beyond the prison walls. He stayed quiet for so long that Ryan thought he would not answer. Finally he spoke. I spent many years helping young men prepare for places where fear could make bad decisions. Ryan looked at him carefully. Did they listen? A small smile appeared on Samuel's face. The good ones did. Officer Hayes was standing only a short distance away, checking the perimeter gate. He heard every word. His heart began to beat a little faster. Instructor. Discipline. Observation. Calm under pressure. It all fit together, but one piece was still missing. Across the yard, Jason Walker had also been watching the conversation. He slowly stood up from the concrete table where he had been sitting alone. His friends looked at him. Where are you going? Jason kept his eyes on Samuel. I am tired of guessing. He started walking across the yard while Ryan noticed him coming closer. Frank Miller lowered his newspaper from the bench near the wall. Officer Hayes looked up from his clipboard. Samuel remained seated, watching the sunset without the slightest sign of concern. Jason stopped directly in front of him and folded his arms. The entire yard seemed to grow quieter. Then he looked at the old inmate and asked the question everyone inside Blackstone had been wondering since the first day. What exactly did you teach for all those years? The question seemed to hang over the recreation yard long after Jason Walker finished speaking. Even the usual sounds of Blackstone State Prison felt quieter for a moment. Men walking the track slowed down without realizing it. Frank Miller lowered his newspaper. Officer Michael Hayes looked up from the perimeter gate. Ryan Cole sat perfectly still beside Samuel Brooks, waiting for an answer. Samuel remained seated on the old wooden bench, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the outer fence before turning his eyes back to Jason. I taught people how to think before they acted, he said quietly. Jason frowned. That is it. Samuel nodded. That was always the hardest lesson. A few inmates nearby exchanged confused looks. The answer sounded too simple. Jason folded his arms. You expect me to believe that? Samuel looked at him without the slightest sign of irritation. You asked what I taught. Jason took one step closer. What kind of people? Ryan looked nervous. Frank slowly stood up from his bench. Officer Hayes quietly started walking toward them, though he stayed several yards away. Samuel was silent for a moment. Finally he answered. Young men. Jason laughed once. School teachers do not carry themselves the way you do. Samuel looked down at the ground for a second. Life teaches different lessons to different people. The answer only seemed to make Jason more curious. He had spent his entire life reading weakness in other people. Fear, pride, anger, desperation. He knew all of them. But the old black inmate sitting in front of him showed none of those things. It was almost like talking to someone who had already heard every insult before and decided long ago that none of them mattered. Ryan finally spoke. Maybe you should just leave it alone. Jason looked at him. Why? Ryan glanced at Samuel. Because I do not think he is hiding from you. Jason frowned. Then what is he doing? Frank answered before Samuel could speak. He is giving you a chance to stop asking the wrong question. Jason turned toward the older inmate. You know something? Frank folded his newspaper carefully. I know that some people spend their whole lives proving themselves, and others never have to. Officer Hayes reached the edge of the group just as the evening whistle sounded. Recreation time was over. Inmates slowly started walking back toward the main building. Jason looked at Samuel one last time. I am not finished with this conversation. Samuel stood up from the bench with the same steady movement he always used. Most conversations take time. Then he simply walked toward the prison doors with Ryan beside him. Frank followed a few steps behind. Hayes remained where he was, watching the older man disappear inside. Something about that short exchange stayed with him. It was not what Samuel had said. It was what he had not said. Later that evening, after dinner, Hayes sat alone in the records office. Samuel's transfer file lay open on the desk beside a computer screen. The officer entered another request for background information. The machine processed the search for several seconds before a message appeared. Additional documentation unavailable. Federal Archive reference detected. Contact administration for authorization. Hayes stared at the screen. In 20 years of corrections work, he had never seen a response like that. He quietly printed the page and carried it to Warden Charles Donovan's office. The older warden adjusted his glasses and read the message twice. Where did you get this? Hayes pointed toward the computer room. It came up during a routine search. Donovan looked at Samuel's file. Leave this with me. Hayes hesitated. Sir, who is this man? The warden slowly closed the folder. Right now? Officer Hayes, I think that is exactly the question we are not supposed to ask. Meanwhile, back inside cell block C, Ryan climbed onto the top bunk and looked down at Samuel. The older man was carefully folding his blanket for the night. Every corner matched perfectly. Every movement looked practiced. Ryan watched quietly before speaking. I think Jason expected a different answer. Samuel smiled slightly without looking up. People usually do. Ryan rested his head against the wall. Were you really just a teacher? Samuel finished folding the blanket and placed it at the end of the bed. Then he looked toward the small window where the moonlight slipped through the bars. I spent a very long time helping young men come home safe. Ryan waited for him to say more, but the room fell silent. Outside the cell, Jason Walker stood in the corridor pretending to talk with his friends. In truth, he had heard every single word. The words Samuel Brooks spoke that night stayed with Ryan Cole long after the lights inside cell block C were turned off. I spent a very long time helping young men come home safe. Ryan lay awake on the top bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what kind of teacher would describe his life that way. Down below, Samuel rested quietly with his hands folded across his chest, breathing slowly as though the noise of the prison had disappeared completely. Across the room, Jason Walker sat on the edge of his own bunk pretending to read an old magazine, but his mind was somewhere else. He had heard every word too. The next morning Blackstone State Prison woke to the sound of heavy rain striking the windows. The yard was closed, sending everyone toward indoor work assignments. Samuel, Ryan, and Frank Miller returned to the maintenance building while Jason and several others were assigned to organize old storage lockers in the same area. Officer Michael Hayes looked at the assignment sheet and frowned. He had not expected them to end up together again. Inside the building, rain tapped softly against the metal roof while inmates worked in silence. Samuel carried a box of old tools to one of the shelves and carefully placed it in line with the others. Ryan noticed something unusual. Every time Samuel entered a new section of the room, his eyes quietly moved from door to window, from window to hallway, and then across the people nearby. It happened so naturally that most people would never notice it. Ryan waited until they were alone for a moment. Can I ask you something? Samuel looked at him. You usually do. Ryan pointed around the room. Why do you always look everywhere when you walk into a place? Samuel thought for a second before answering. Because details matter. Ryan smiled. You make it sound important. Samuel rested one hand on the shelf. A small detail can change a very big day. Officer Hayes happened to hear the answer while checking inventory forms. Another memory returned to him. During that old security seminar years ago, the retired instructor had stopped the class and written 6 words across a whiteboard. The smallest detail saves the biggest life. Hayes felt the same strange feeling return to his chest. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Across the room, Jason Walker had also been watching Samuel. One of his friends leaned closer. You still think he is hiding something? Jason looked toward the older man arranging the shelves. I know he is. Then ask him again. Jason slowly shook his head. No, why not? Jason stared at Samuel for a long moment. Because I do not think he lies. The younger inmate laughed quietly. Maybe he just likes confusing people. Jason folded his arms. No, I think he tells the truth. I just do not think we understand it. At lunch, the rain continued falling, forcing everyone back into the cafeteria early. Samuel carried his tray to the table by the window as always. Ryan and Frank sat beside him. A few moments later, something happened that surprised the entire room. Jason Walker walked across the cafeteria carrying his own tray and stopped beside their table. The conversations around them grew quieter. Frank lowered his newspaper. Officer Hayes looked up from the entrance. Jason glanced at the empty chair. Anybody sitting here? Ryan looked completely confused. Samuel simply nodded. No, Jason sat down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Jason looked at the older man. You said you helped young men come home safe. Samuel looked at his coffee. Yes. Did you ever lose one? The question was so quiet that Ryan almost did not hear it. Samuel stayed silent for a long moment. The cafeteria seemed to disappear around him. Then he looked out the window at the falling rain. Every teacher remembers the students he could not help. Jason watched his face carefully. For the first time since Samuel arrived at Blackstone, he saw something different in the older man's eyes. Not fear, not anger, sadness, real and quiet. Jason lowered his own eyes toward the table. He had expected another mysterious answer. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a man carrying memories far heavier than anyone inside that prison could imagine. Officer Hayes watched the entire exchange from across the room. He looked down at the transfer file one more time and quietly whispered to himself, Who were you teaching, Samuel Brooks? The rain finally stopped during the night, and by morning the air above Blackstone State Prison felt cool and clear. Water still rested in small puddles across the yard, reflecting the guard towers and the endless lines of steel fencing. Samuel Brooks walked beside Ryan Cole toward the maintenance building carrying the same quiet expression he always wore. Ryan had barely spoken since the conversation in the cafeteria. The older man's answer had stayed with him. Every teacher remembers the students he could not help. It did not sound like something a schoolteacher would say. It sounded heavier than that. Can I ask you one more question? Ryan finally said. Samuel looked over. You usually do. Ryan smiled a little. Did you ever have to say goodbye to the people you taught? Samuel looked toward the distant horizon beyond the prison walls. Many times. Was it hard? Samuel thought for a moment. The difficult part was never saying goodbye. Ryan waited. What was it then? Samuel lowered his eyes, not knowing if they would make it home. The younger inmate did not ask anything else. Somehow he felt that another question would cross a line the older man had spent years protecting. Inside the maintenance building, Officer Michael Hayes was already waiting. The warden had returned Samuel's transfer file early that morning with one simple instruction. Do not request additional records. Hayes had read the note 3 times. In all his years working corrections, nobody had ever told him to stop looking into an inmate's background. The instruction only made him more curious. Samuel quietly began sorting another shipment of supplies while Ryan organized cleaning equipment nearby. Hayes watched for several minutes before walking over. Mr. Brooks. Samuel looked up. Yes, sir. Hayes held the clipboard against his side. You ever work with government contracts? Ryan looked over immediately. Frank Miller, repairing another chair across the room, paused long enough to listen. Samuel answered without hesitation. A long time ago, I worked wherever people needed good teachers. Hayes nodded slowly. That sounds like important work. Samuel placed another box on the shelf. Helping people always is. The answer was polite, but it revealed nothing. Across the room, Frank smiled quietly to himself. He had known from the beginning that Samuel would never tell his story directly. Some men talked about their past because they wanted attention. Others stayed silent because they had already carried enough of it. At lunch, the cafeteria felt different than it had during Samuel's first day. The laughter around Jason Walker's table was quieter now. A few younger inmates even nodded politely towards Samuel as he passed. Ryan noticed it immediately. People are treating you differently. Samuel sat down by the window. People change. Frank carried his coffee over and took his usual seat. "No," the old inmate said. "People finally start seeing what was there all along." Before Samuel could answer, Jason Walker walked across the cafeteria again. This time he was alone. The room grew quiet as he stopped beside the table. He looked at Samuel for several seconds before speaking. "I thought about what you said yesterday." Samuel looked up. "About teachers?" Jason nodded. "You said you wanted your students to come home safe." "Yes." Jason hesitated. "Did they?" The question carried none of the challenge it had the day before. It sounded honest. Samuel looked down at his coffee cup. The silence stretched across the table. Finally he answered. "Some did." Jason lowered his eyes. "And the others?" Samuel looked out the window where sunlight reflected across the wet prison yard. "The others taught me to appreciate every day I was given." Nobody at the table spoke after that. Ryan felt a lump in his throat. Frank quietly removed his glasses. Even Jason seemed different. The young man who had laughed when the breakfast tray hit the floor now stood silently in front of the older inmate, as though he had finally realized there were stories too heavy to make fun of. Across the cafeteria, Officer Michael Hayes watched the entire exchange. He looked down at the thin transfer file under his arm one more time. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Tucked inside the back cover was a small folded page that had not been there earlier. Hayes carefully opened it. There was only one line typed across the center. Prior occupation classification, senior instructor. Federal Special Operations Training Division. Hayes stared at the words. His hands slowly tightened around the paper. At that exact moment, Samuel Brooks happened to glance across the room. And for the first time since the old inmate arrived at Blackstone, Officer Hayes realized he was looking at a man who had spent 30 years preparing America's toughest soldiers for the hardest days of their lives. Officer Michael Hayes stood in the empty hallway outside the cafeteria long after the lunch period had ended. The folded page remained in his hand, and he read the single line over and over again. Senior Instructor. Federal Special Operations Training Division. The words did not explain everything, but they explained enough. Suddenly, the careful way Samuel Brooks organized shelves, the quiet discipline, the steady eyes, and the strange calm that never seemed to leave him all made sense. Hayes slowly folded the paper and slipped it back into the transfer file. For the first time in 20 years working corrections, he felt less like a guard watching an inmate and more like a student standing in front of an old teacher. Across the prison yard, Samuel and Ryan walked toward the maintenance building for the afternoon assignment. Ryan noticed that Officer Hayes seemed different. The older officer nodded politely as they passed. Samuel returned the gesture without saying a word. "I think he likes you," Ryan whispered. Samuel smiled faintly. "People are usually kind when they understand something." Ryan looked confused. "Do they understand you now?" Samuel glanced toward the blue sky above the prison walls. "Probably not." Inside the maintenance building, Frank Miller was already repairing another chair. He looked up as Samuel entered. "You know," Frank said, "I have been thinking about what you told Jason." Samuel picked up a box of supplies. "Which part?" Frank adjusted his glasses. "About helping young men come home safe." Samuel quietly placed the box on a shelf. Frank looked at him carefully. "I think you love those boys." The older black inmate stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, he nodded once. "I did." Ryan had never heard Samuel answer a personal question so directly before. "Were they like family?" he asked. Samuel looked down at his hands. "When you spend enough years helping people become the best version of themselves, they become part of your life whether you expect it or not." Frank slowly smiled. "I knew it." Ryan looked between the two older men. "Knew what?" Frank folded his newspaper. "Nobody talks about students that way unless teaching was more than a job." At that same moment, Jason Walker stood outside the open doorway of the building. He had come to ask another question, but instead he stayed quiet and listened. Something inside him had changed since the day he kicked the old man's breakfast tray onto the floor. He had expected anger. He had expected revenge. Instead, he found kindness, patience, and a sadness that somehow carried more strength than shouting ever could. Later that afternoon, Warden Charles Donovan called Officer Hayes into his office. The transfer file rested on the desk between them. Donovan closed the office door before speaking. "You saw the additional page." Hayes nodded. "Yes, sir." The warden looked at the folder for a moment. "I made one phone call this morning." Hayes waited. The person on the other end told me that Samuel Brooks spent 3 decades preparing special operations soldiers for assignments most people will never hear about. Hayes felt his heart beat a little faster. Did they say anything else? Donovan slowly nodded. Only one thing. The room fell silent. They told me that if Samuel Brooks ever speaks, it would be wise to listen. Hayes looked through the office window toward the prison yard below. Samuel was carrying a stack of old books back toward the library with Ryan walking beside him. He looked exactly the same as always. Quiet, humble, ordinary. Yet now Hayes knew that generations of America's toughest soldiers had once stood where he was standing now, listening to that same calm voice. Evening count arrived, and the inmates slowly returned to cell block C. Jason Walker waited near the entrance until Samuel walked past him. For a second, he almost spoke, but the words would not come. Samuel stopped and looked at him. Something on your mind? Jason lowered his eyes. I have been thinking. Samuel nodded. That is usually a good place to start. Jason looked back up. I think I judged you before I knew anything about you. Samuel smiled softly. Most people do. Ryan and Frank watched the exchange from a few feet away. Neither man said a word. They could both see it happening. The fear that had once surrounded Jason Walker was slowly being replaced by something he had never really understood before. Respect. And somewhere inside the administration office, Warden Donovan quietly locked Samuel's transfer file inside his desk, knowing that the old inmate walking the halls of Blackstone was not simply a prisoner. He was a man who had spent 30 years building heroes and had never once asked the world to remember his name. The days after Warden Charles Donovan locked away Samuel Brooks's file felt different inside Blackstone State Prison. Nobody announced a change. There were no speeches and no new rules. Yet something quiet had begun spreading through cell block C. Ryan Cole noticed it first. The younger inmates who once spent their mornings trying to impress Jason Walker had started gathering around the old table near the window where Samuel usually sat with a history book and a cup of coffee. They did not come because he told stories about himself. In fact, he almost never did. They came because he listened. One morning Ryan arrived carrying his breakfast and found 2 younger prisoners already sitting with Samuel. One of them looked nervous. Mr. Brooks, he said softly, how do you stop thinking about mistakes? Samuel placed his book on the table and looked at the young man. You remember them. The inmate frowned. That is it. Samuel nodded. If you learn something from a mistake, it becomes a lesson instead of a chain. Ryan looked around the table. Nobody spoke after that. Somehow the simple answer seemed enough. Across the cafeteria, Jason Walker watched the conversation from a distance. One of his old friends sat beside him. You know, everybody is starting to look at him differently. Jason nodded. I know. Does that bother you? Jason thought for a moment. Then he slowly shook his head. No, the younger inmate looked surprised. Really? Jason kept his eyes on Samuel. I spent a long time thinking respect came from making people afraid. He looked down at his own tray. I think I was wrong. Frank Miller heard the conversation while passing by with his newspaper. He smiled quietly, but said nothing. Some lessons could only be learned when a person was ready. Officer Michael Hayes had also noticed the change. During his rounds, arguments seemed to end faster whenever Samuel was nearby. Younger inmates spoke more respectfully to one another. Even Jason Walker had stopped trying to prove himself every hour of the day. Hayes stood outside the library that afternoon and watched Samuel help Ryan place old books back onto the shelves. Every book was lined up carefully. Every space was left better than they found it. The officer remembered the line inside the hidden file. Senior Instructor, Federal Special Operations Training Division. Hayes still had questions, but they no longer felt important. The answer he really needed was standing right in front of him. A great teacher never stops teaching. Late that afternoon, Warden Donovan called Hayes into his office. The old transfer file rested on the desk one last time. Donovan opened the folder and removed a single page. This arrived from Washington. Hayes looked at the paper. Across the top were only a few typed words. Archived Service Confirmation. The warden handed it to him. Hayes read quietly. 30 years of instructional service supporting United States Special Operations personnel. No additional information authorized for release. He slowly lowered the page. That is all. Donovan nodded. That is all they are willing to tell us. Hayes looked through the office window toward the prison yard below. Samuel was sitting on a bench while Ryan and 2 younger inmates listened to him talk. There were no dramatic stories, no medals, no grand speeches, just quiet conversation beneath the evening sky. You know, Hayes said softly, I think those 30 years explain why he never talks about it. Donovan looked at him. Why? Hayes smiled faintly. Because the best teachers care more about the students than themselves. Evening count arrived as the sun disappeared behind the outer fence. The inmates slowly returned to their cells. Jason Walker waited near the entrance until Samuel walked by carrying his old history book. This time Jason stopped him. Ryan and Frank watched from a few feet away. Officer Hayes stood in the hallway finishing paperwork. Jason looked uncomfortable for the first time since anyone could remember. I have been wanting to say something. Samuel waited patiently. Jason took a slow breath. The first day you got here, I knocked your breakfast onto the floor. Samuel nodded once. I remember. Jason lowered his eyes. I thought being strong meant making someone else feel small. The older man stayed quiet. Jason looked back up. You spent your whole life helping people become stronger, and I could not even recognize it. Samuel smiled gently. Most people do not recognize good teachers until much later. Jason stood there for a second before quietly stepping aside. Samuel nodded politely and continued walking toward his cell. Ryan looked at Frank. Do you think he forgave him? Frank folded his newspaper and smiled. I think a man who spent 30 years preparing others for hard days probably learned a long time ago that carrying anger is the heaviest burden of all. The following week began like every other week inside Blackstone State Prison. The steel gates opened before sunrise. Officers changed shifts. Inmates lined up for breakfast beneath the pale morning light. Yet anyone who had lived there long enough could feel that something had changed. Samuel Brooks walked into the cafeteria carrying his tray exactly as he had on his first day. His shoulders were straight. His movements were calm. The old history book rested beneath one arm until he reached the table by the window. Ryan Cole and Frank Miller were already waiting for him. Ryan smiled. I saved your seat. Samuel placed the book on the table. Thank you. Before any of them could sit down, footsteps crossed the cafeteria floor. The conversations around the room slowly faded. Jason Walker stood there holding a tray of his own. In his other hand was a brand new plastic meal tray taken from the kitchen supply shelf. He looked at Samuel for a long moment before placing it gently on the table. I think this belongs to you, he said quietly. Ryan looked surprised. Frank lowered his newspaper. Officer Michael Hayes watched from the entrance without saying a word. Samuel looked at the tray and then back at Jason. I already have one. Jason nodded. I know. He took a slow breath. But the first one should never have ended up on the floor. The entire cafeteria remained silent. Nobody expected the man who had once ruled cell block C through fear to say something like that. Samuel rested one hand on the new tray. A small smile crossed his face. Thank you. Jason lowered his eyes for a second. I spent my whole life thinking strength was about making people back down. Samuel looked around the room before answering. Real strength helps other people stand up. Jason nodded slowly. He did not have another reply. He simply picked up his breakfast and sat down at a nearby table. For the first time since anyone could remember, he sat alone by choice. Ryan watched him for a moment before looking back at Samuel. You changed him. Samuel quietly opened his history book. No, Ryan frowned. Then what happened? Samuel turned one page and looked out the window where the morning sun touched the prison yard. People change themselves when they are ready. Frank smiled behind his newspaper. That sounds like something a teacher would say. Samuel laughed softly. Maybe I picked up a few habits over the years. Later that afternoon, Officer Hayes was called into Warden Charles Donovan's office one final time. The old transfer file sat on the desk beside a sealed envelope. Donovan slid it across the table. This arrived this morning. Hayes opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. Effective immediately, all archived service records associated with Samuel Brooks are permanently restricted under federal authority. No further inquiry required. At the bottom was one handwritten sentence. Let the man keep his peace. Hayes slowly folded the paper and placed it back inside the envelope. He looked through the office window toward the library courtyard below. Samuel sat on a bench with Ryan and two younger inmates, talking quietly while helping them repair old books. You know, Hayes said softly, I think the country remembers him even if nobody else does. Warden Donovan nodded. The best people usually leave their mark through others. Evening count arrived, and the inmates slowly returned to their cells. Ryan walked beside Samuel carrying the old history book. "Can I ask you one last question?" Samuel smiled. "You usually do." Ryan looked down the hallway. "After everything you have done, after all those years teaching those soldiers, do you ever wish people knew who you really were?" Samuel stopped walking and looked through the narrow window at the fading sky beyond the prison walls. He thought about the question for a long time. Finally, he answered, "The people who needed to know already did." Ryan looked at him quietly. "And what about everyone else?" Samuel took the book from his hands. "If I helped one person become better than they were yesterday, that is enough." They continued walking until they reached the cell block. Jason stood near the entrance and gave Samuel a small nod of respect. Frank raised his newspaper with a smile. Officer Hayes watched from the hallway above. Warden Donovan closed the office blinds and locked away the last remaining file. Nobody inside Blackstone State Prison would ever know every detail about the quiet old inmate who walked among them. They would never hear the stories of the young men he trained or the burdens he carried through 30 years of service. But they would all remember one simple truth long after he was gone. The strongest person in the room is often the one who has nothing left to prove, and the greatest teachers are the ones who never ask to be remembered.